During the Vietnam War, the forces fighting for the South Vietnamese were beset by the guerrilla tactics of the North Viet Cong. The Viet Cong would employ all manner of booby traps, surprise attacks, and ingenious weapons to combat the technological superiority of their enemy. Very often the Viet Cong would retreat, rest, and plan their attacks from a labyrinth of underground tunnels and bases. The job given to enter these tunnels and flush out the Viet Cong was arguably one of the more terrifying and dangerous jobs of the war, and those brave enough to venture into the underground mazes were called tunnel rats. In today's video, we will cover just what these underground tunnels were like, the men who entered them, and what it would be like fighting in such a claustrophobic environment. Whilst the tunnels played a major role during the Vietnam War, they had been used for quite some time before. During the First Indochina War, or Anti-French Resistance War, the communist forces of the Viet Minh dug a series of tunnels. This process began towards the end of the 1940s, with the tunnels used to connect communities and to allow for guerrilla combat against the French colonial forces. But lessons were learned, and following the start of the Vietnam War, these tunnels were expanded. In the early 1960s, the Viet Cong communist forces would expand the tunnels and make great use of them against their enemies. During the war, the tunnels of the Cu Chi covered a distance of over 150 miles, connecting bases from Saigon to the Cambodian border. The tunnels would prove to be the best way to hide from the American forces, who would employ defoliation and aerial reconnaissance to root out the Viet Cong forces who would melt back into the jungles. The tunnels would range in complexity, from simple burrows to vast specialized rooms, wells, and storage facilities. The tunnels would have hidden entrances both in the jungles and in the villages friendly to the Viet Cong. These entrances would be incredibly small and designed to avoid detection. Hospitals, barracks, and weapons factories would be built underground. Some of the rooms would have electricity, but often the only light would be from candles or handheld flashlights. The tunnels linking such rooms would weave through the underground, some having dead ends, hidden traps, and all manner of wildlife to make them dangerous places to those who did not know the layout. The elevation and size of the tunnels would often change, adding further to the difficulty. The tunnels were built too deep to be affected by even the heaviest of bombings. Attempts to use gas or water to flood out the tunnel would prove to be ineffective, as they were designed to counteract attempts with special ventilation rooms and tunnels designed to mitigate flooding. It was into this warren that combat engineers, nicknamed tunnel rats, would attempt to disrupt the Viet Cong's tactics. Some of the first tunnel rats would be from the Australian military, but the practice was soon spread amongst the rest of the Allied forces in Vietnam. When the tunnel rats were tasked with entering the underground bases, they engaged in a form of warfare that was far from conventional. Those who went into the tunnels would volunteer, meaning it would be those brave enough to spend hours in the claustrophobic darkness, unaware of any enemies lurking in the shadows. Whilst tunnel rats were famed for their underground exploits, their primary role would be as combat engineers. They would be responsible for locating and disarming all manner of mines and traps that would be planted. It would be common for the Viet Cong to launch diversionary attacks on a military base so that others could lay anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Many more would be planted on approaches to villages or suspected helicopter landing zones. Arguably the most infamous of the mines used was the M16, otherwise known as the jumping jack. The device, once triggered, springs up into the air and detonates around the waist. Casualties from this device would be catastrophic, each potentially causing dozens of casualties. Much of their time would be spent dealing with these devices above ground, whilst hoping to destroy caches of weapons and limiting their deployment with actions below ground. A link will be pinned in the comments to the accounts of Jim Marrett, a combat engineer and tunnel rat who served with the Australian Engineering Corps. According to his account, the role was incredibly dangerous, highlighted by the 33% casualty rate suffered by his unit. And whilst many would die in the tunnels, many more would die above ground attempting to disarm mines and save their comrades. But it would be in the tunnels that a different level of danger would present itself. Due to the confined spaces, the men would be armed with pistols, revolvers, knives, and explosives to destroy any weapon caches that they might come across. But even with handguns, firing in such a confined space could be deafening. Smaller caliber weapons with suppressors were favoured, as they would produce a smaller muzzle flash. There are, however, the odd instance of tunnel rats using shotguns in the confined spaces. When travelling through the tunnels, the men had to be aware of any traps that might litter the way. One of the more common traps would be holes dug in the tunnels, with a fake floor hiding dozens of sharpened punji sticks. Very often these sticks would be coated in poison, venom, or human feces, as to doom the victim to a deadly infection. Other dangers could include false walls where the Viet Cong soldiers could lie in wait to ambush the unaware. Some traps even involved dropping insects, scorpions, or snakes, just adding to the terror and danger. And whilst the tunnels were generally well made, there was always a risk of collapse and being buried alive. Perhaps most disturbing of all was that some rooms would store the Viet Cong dead, left to rot and obscure the casualties inflicted. The rewards for braving such conditions could be great. Uncovering and destroying a cache of mines could save the lives of their friends, and would mean they would have to deal with less mines above ground. All manner of intelligence could be recovered as well, as high-ranking Viet Cong commanders could be captured for interrogation. In 1966, Operation Crimp was launched in the Cu Chi region, which uncovered the extensive network of tunnels. A combined American and Australian force sought to clear the tunnels. Whilst plenty of the Viet Cong supplies were captured and destroyed, they were not able to clear out all of the tunnels successfully. The Cu Chi tunnels would go on to play a major role in the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack on the American and South Vietnamese soldiers. Their tunnels were vital in allowing the Viet Cong soldiers to move undetected, getting in position without giving away their upcoming attacks. It would not be until 1970 that American B-52 bombers dropped a huge number of delayed fuse bombs. These bombs would bury deeper into the ground before detonating, rendering the tunnels at least partly unusable. But even to this day, you can visit the Cu Chi tunnels as a tourist attraction, and see how you might fit inside such a space. But remember, the tunnels were actually made bigger for the tourists, so the real tunnels would have been a lot smaller. From 1965 to 1972, around 700 tunnel rats were deployed. In that time, 36 were killed and 200 were wounded. The role of the tunnel rat is arguably the most disturbing role one could undertake during the Vietnam War. Having to fight alone in such a confined space would have been a daunting task. Warfare is traumatic enough, without adding to it the close proximity and claustrophobic terror of fighting underground.